Good morning. This is Pankaj Kumar. Today I'm gonna explain, talk about Age of Chaucer, Age of Geoffrey Chaucer. This is the second video of Geoffrey Chaucer. Or we know this period, this age. In this age, there were three major influences that shaped Chaucer's age. What were three major influences? The three major influences that shaped Chaucer's age was social and political unrest, Reformation, Renaissance. There was social and political unrest. There was Reformation happening at the religious side, with a Reformation happening within the Roman Catholic Church and also Christianity in general. There was also the this major influence of Renaissance. So Chaucer's writing also, we can see a reflection of all these things happening in Chaucer's writing, though he was not entirely a poet of the people, he was mostly a court poet. We shall be coming to that in a short while. And before that, it is important to note that Chaucer's writing can be divided into three different periods. There was a French period, an Italian period, and an English period. During the French and Italian period, we find that Chaucer was heavily influenced by the writers of France, by the writers from Italy, and also a major influence of the Renaissance. Ideals were also got into his writing, his thought process, the way in which his writing were structured, the metrical schemes that he used, the alliteration that he used, so and so forth. Some of his major works include Troilus and Cressida, House of Fame, and Parliament of Fowls. But his magnum opus was certainly Canterbury Tales. This was during a time when English language was vying with French and Italian and Latin. And we also find that Canterbury Tales in terms of English language studies and literary studies. It led to the standardization of English language and also to the popularization of the language. And significantly, though a lot of things were happening in the 14th century, the century was quite eventful, not just in terms of social political unrest, also in terms of the major crisis and the major turn of events that went through this century. Chaucer's writing were quite removed from the realities of the time, in the sense that he continued to be influenced by all these happenings in and around him. But his writing for and significantly, though a lot of things were happening in the 14th century, though the century was quite eventful, not just in terms of socio-political unrest, also in terms of the major crisis and the major turn of events that we went through the century. Chaucer's writing were quite removed from the realities of the time, in the sense that he continued to be influenced by all these happenings in and around him. But his writings, for say, we cannot find a reflection of the times. That was primarily because he was not a poet of the people, he was court poet, he wrote for the courtiers. His influence were primarily surrounded by all the courtly influences, so there was very little connection that he had with his ordinary people, though he knew the people through his travel, through the various kinds of offices that he held, the various ways in which he could interact as an as a bureaucratic officer. But other than that, his life was primarily surrounded by courtiers, and there was a way in which he could stay away. He could afford to stay away from the major religious and social movement of this period. And we also find that in his writings, what makes his writing very significant is that many historians and literary critics of the later period, they feel that it was in his work that the first full expression of the English sense of humor was found. As one of the historians would describe it, English sense of humor was partly cynical and mostly kindly. So it has its origins in Chaucer's writing and Chaucer's expression. And we find that Chaucer was heavily influenced by the Italian humanism. So though he belonged to the courtly class, though there was way in which he was removed from the ground realities of the society, he was inspired by the free and secular spirit which was contributed by the Italian humanism and also various other Renaissance ideas. So this had led a lot of freeness in his writing and a lot of general liberalism in his writing as well. So we need to take a very detailed look at Canterbury Tales, which is the magnum opus of Chaucer and also the defining work that inaugurated English literature in many different ways. If we try to summarize Canterbury Tales, it is an unfinished collection of 24 comic and moral stories. It was a set of stories told by a group of pilgrims on their way to the shrine of St. Thomas Becket at Canterbury. This was structured in such a way that it was a story within a story. There is this major framework of story happening, which is the travel of a certain set of characters to shrine of St. Thomas Becket, and they decide to tell a story on the way, two stories on the way, and two on their way back. And in order to keep them out of the boredom and also to keep each other company, and they also decide the best storyteller will get free meal at Tabard Inn. That is from where they began their journey. So this main story and within the framework of this main story there are these different tales which are being told by different characters in Canterbury Tales. So this is in fact a story within a story. The structure is in such a way. So this Canterbury Tales, though it is written by Chaucer, who was a courtly figure, we get snapshot of the age in very different ways. We get a sense of medieval life through a range of characters that he portrayed for us. In fact, this is the most elaborate and the most extensive kind of portrait of the medieval period in that sense. We have, for instance, certain characters from the old feudal order, including the knight, squire, yeoman, and plowman. From the merchant class, there is the character of the merchant, the man of law, guide, guidesman, and the cook. From the ecclesiastical class from the clergy, we have priors, the monk, friar, and the pardoner, and each one of them they have different tales to tell. And all these tales, interestingly, are very entertaining. It is hilarious and it is open to a range of interpretation. It is in this range that we find the exemplary skill of Chaucer, the main, because we do see that though he was apparently removed from the harsh realities of 14th century, his tale reflects that he did have a sound knowledge of what was happening in around him. And also the entire work is structured and fashioned in such a way that it continues to hold the interest of many critics and historians even in the contemporary. And for someone who is very interested in the studies of rhetoric, the study of how English literary studies evolved, this Canterbury Tales also present an interesting literary tour, though this is as early as the 14th century when many of different genera of writing had not yet begun to emerge. We get a literary tour, a fairly extensive tour through different forms of writing such as romances, Pablo, and there are these occasions where the stories of saints' lives are retold. There are allegories. So many ways it is a wonderful read for any student of literature when they begin their studies. And this work, Canterbury Tales, it was written over a span of time during Chaucer's lifetime, but it was properly published only 1478 after Caxton printing press was installed in England. So it was quite fortunate that unlike the many other texts of the Old English period, Canterbury Tales was not lost or forgotten, but it was preserved quite well into the posterity, thanks to the techniques of printing that emerged in Britain during this time. Having said that, the 14th century was also an age of transition in many different ways, even while the writing of English literature was getting consolidated in the 14th century. There were many other events which contributed to the consolidation of English language and literature. For instance, it is during this period that we see the rise of the middle class, the birth of nationalism, the transition from feudal to free society, and more importantly, the emergence of humanism, which fostered a spirit of inquiry. A questioning attitude, a critical attitude, a lot of enthusiasm for new learning, and very importantly, the expansion of English literature as well. So, when we say that a lot of things were happening during this period, it would be quite natural to expect a little more than Chaucer out of this period, because this way this was in many ways a fertile ground for the emergence of new languages, new literatures. So it was only quite natural that there were other poets who also wrote during this period. However, it is just a happy accident of history that Chaucer gained prominence over all the other writers. Other poets of Chaucer age we will see here. So this is not the time for us to evaluate or to critically engage with why certain writers gain more prominence over the others in literary history. But we do note that they were other writers during this time, especially poets such as John Gower, William Langland, and they were quite different from Chaucer. None of them had a stately position, and they were not really court poets to begin with. And John Gower, in fact, he wrote a lot about the unstable state of contemporary English literature. He also presented, unlike Chaucer, a gloomy view of the social condition of the time. He was quite aware of the challenges that the age was going through, and we do see very severe criticism of the clergy in his writing. This was something that Chaucer hardly engaged with. In Canterbury Tales, we do find a statical way through which Chaucer tries to critique, but we do not find any open criticism in Chaucer's writing. But John Gower was quite open about his criticism, and he is also sympathetic to the teachings of Wycliffe and his followers. Reformation was entirely spreaded by Wycliffe in England, and his significance is quite noted by social historians. But in Chaucer, we do not find much of a reflection of the spirit of Reformation. On the other hand, in poets such as John Gower and William Langland's writing, there is a way in which we find that ideals of Reformation and had contributed a lot the emergence of literature. But John Gower uh, lost out in certain ways because he did not write entirely in English. He was one of the many writers who could not make up his mind concerning the best medium. Because if you think about those times in 13th, 14th, or 15th century was a period of transition, and there was no way in which one could predict which language would have a dominance in the preceding in the following times. So Chaucer was perhaps more insightful and had better foresight, or perhaps he was just fortunate to have written all his works mostly in English. But there was a lot of writers like John Gower who were still writing in many different languages at the same time, in French, Italian, Latin, and also in English. So because of that, we have little access to the works of John Gower written in language other than English, because they were not included in the proper tradition of English literary studies. And there was William Langland, whose work, The Vision of William Conquering Piers Plowman, it was considered almost par with Canterbury Tales, except that he gave a very different view of England. And many historians feel that Langland's writing complement Canterbury Tales and Chaucer writings quite well. England's work is considered as a first providential work in England, and also he had which mentally exposed the sloth and vice of the church, and his heads on record the struggle and the virtues of common men, which is something that is severely lacking in Chaucer's work. And there is a lot of critical work available on to the way in which Chaucer and Langland presents the medieval age in very different ways. Our purpose here is not to judge or evaluate them, but to see them for their literary merit as well as for the ways in which they have contributed. They have worked as a mirror of those times to help us understand how writers positioned in different locations, different historical and political locations, looked at different ages and how each age was represented as well. And in this also gives us a sense of how the same age ends up producing writer of different caliber and writers who look at the spirit of time in very different ways. And there is also John Barber, who is considered a father of Scottish poetry. His works Bruce in 1375 that is considered a history of Scotland's struggle for freedom, and it is considered as a seminal work which even later one brings together these different but related histories in the larger schemes of literary studies. And there is very limited prose during Chaucer's age, medieval age. In fact, poetry was beginning to flourish. Poetry was thriving, but just in the Anglo-Saxon period and the Old English period. Prose had very little to contribute in terms of literature. It was merely functional in sense that prose was used to communicate, but it had not yet come of the um, level of literature as we understand literature today. And Chaucer also wrote a lot of prose, but very little has been included as literature. And compared to Canterbury Tale, his poetic work, most of them do not even stand a chance. We will say in the next videos prose in Chaucer's age. Thank you very much.